And we're back in my classroom! Cantos 11 through 13!
Bum 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 bum. It's Inferno, Inferno. Bum.
Okay, Canto 11 begins as Dante and Virgil are descending down from the first big section of hell to the second big section of hell. As we mentioned before, everything is in threes. There are three overall sections of hell. The first is the Incontinent, those sinners who have sinned because of their impulses. The second are the violent. Those are the sinners who have sinned in violence against something. And the very lowest section is for the fraudulent, those who have willfully distorted the truth. Again, each of the section has to do with will, but we'll notice geographically that there's a division between each of these three sections. After the Incontinent section, there's a cliff. Now, the reason that they're able to climb down the cliff is because there are jagged boulders and ruin at the edge of a high bank formed by a ring of enormous broken rocks. We came to a halt and looked down on a crueler gathering. Now, where did all these broken rocks come from? Well, that's an important point. We mentioned earlier that there's an emphasis on Christ's victory over hell throughout hell. It's subtle, but it's definitely there. This is another instance of the destruction caused by the earthquake at Christ's death at the moment that he died on the cross, therefore overcoming sin and taking away the sting of death. All throughout hell, as Dante sees these horrifying and terrible places and all these awful things that human beings can do, he's reminded also that there is a victory over evil. As Dante and Virgil climb down this hill, though, they are choked by the overpowering assault of noxious stink. There's a horrible smell that's drifting up from the seventh circle. We'll see where this comes from in just a moment. But for now, the smell is so overpowering that it's difficult for them to climb down. They decide to stop and take a rest until their noses grow accustomed to the scent. But not to waste time, they decide to take this moment to discuss the organization and geography of hell. A lot of this we've already mentioned. The three major overall section, Virgil explains with clarity. He's also going to point out the significance of the individual rings within the seventh circle. You will see in separate groups in the first ring despoilers, plunderers, murderers, everyone who used malicious force on man or thing. To one's own person violence may be done, or to one's own goods. To the second ring are sent all those who now must uselessly atone for robbing themselves of the world, all those who went through their property with dice or dissipation, all those who wept when they should have been content. They are violent against God, who feel negation and blasphemy at heart, who in bitterness hate nature and the bounty of creation. Thus the smallest ring with its impress seals Sodom and Cahors, and those who say evil of God with their heart's recess. So later on, as we're going through the rings of seven, we'll see those kind of sinners. And there are moments when Virgil does not recap those particular sins, neither does Dante. We just have to remember, back in Canto 11, he told us who these people were. Virgil explains about the incontinent, the violent, and the fraudulent, and about the very center circle of hell where the treacherous lie, where Satan himself is. Virgil also explains how the incontinent, those sinners who sin by impulsiveness at the top of the Inferno, are less significant than those who sinned deeper down. Those at the top did not do so by will, but by inattention. Those who did so at the very center are the ones who willed their sin the most.
The violent are frequently an exaggeration of the impulsive sin. It's the same sin, perhaps done in a more calculating way, in a less human way. For example, the violent are an extension of the wrathful. The violent against property, the violent against self, in the sense of destroying one's property, is an extension of the prodigal we saw up in Circle 4. The willfulness of the sins make them darker and deeper into hell.
Virgil also explains the violent against God, nature, and art. The violence against art is very unique, and the explanation is probably better left until we reach those particular sinners. Just remember, when we get to the usurers who are violent against art, their explanation is back here in Canto 11. And so Dante and Virgil descend down from the mountain to the seventh circle, but before they can get into the seventh circle, they run into the overall guardian of the seventh circle, the Minotaur. The Minotaur is a character from mythology who is half bull and half man. In fact, Minos is his stepfather. His wife was cursed and fell in love with a bull and produced the Minotaur. Minos locked the Minotaur in a maze and then fed children to him. He's a terrifying monster that's part beast and part man and all rage. Because of his violent, devouring tendencies, he makes a good guardian over the violent. But there's something else to note about the guardians of the Seventh Circle. The Minotaur, the Centaurs, and the Harpies all have something in common. Each of them is part human, part animal. This shows that violence is a bestial kind of action. It's where our animal natures overtake us and we act out of human reason and character. Violence makes us bestial. When they first see the Minotaur, Virgil makes reference to Theseus, who kills the Minotaur, and to the Minotaur's half-sister, who helped him. The Minotaur, in a rage, jumps up and charges from side to side, giving them the opportunity to slip past. As they walk down, they look at the ruin that they've passed, and Virgil comments how it wasn't always ruined like this, but again, that it came at the earthquake at Christ's death. The point that Virgil says, "I begin to think the universe was moved by love, by which some say the world has often been convulsed to chaos. How divine love shook hell to its very core and broke some of it. But now we come to the violent against others. And what's their contrapasso? They're boiled in a river of blood." That one's pretty easy. All who interfere with others by violence, doing them injury, are boiled in the river of blood that is coming near. You're probably familiar with centaurs from stories like Harry Potter and Narnia, where the centaurs look up to the stars and interpret their ways, and they are so wise and so intelligent. But really, the centaurs in Greek mythology are pretty terrifying. They're very bestial, again, just like the Minotaur. They're wild and raving and vicious. They're always fighting with people and trampling people to death. There's actually only one exception, and he's not a true centaur. He comes from a completely different source. His name is Chiron, not to be confused with Charon, sorry. Chiron was very wise, and he trained a lot of the heroes in mythology. The centaurs have a job down here to shoot the souls that try to climb out of the river. If you're boiling in blood, it's probably not all that comfortable and you try to come up for air, they shoot you down. Make sure you go back down again. Because Dante and Virgil can't cross this river by themselves, Chiron offers Nessus. Nessus is a famous centaur from the story of Hercules. So they ride down to a narrower part of the river and cross there, on Nissus' back. Now, like all the circles, it goes all the way around, but there's one part that's very deep and one part that's shallow. The reason for this is that some souls are more violent than other souls. So the more violent you are, the deeper in the blood you boil. As they cross, Nissus points out some of the great souls here, including Alexander the Great.
These are people who had a lifestyle of blood. It's a little bit more than the wrathful. It's not just one single act of violence. This is more of a lifestyle of violence.
And there are some others mentioned here as well. But a lot of the souls mentioned here are, once again, as you'd expect, political souls. Souls who did great acts that influenced nations. Their sin, their violence had long-reaching repercussions. And so they reach the other side without much mishap and enter into the Wood of Suicide. The Wood of Suicide is watched over by the Harpies, who are half women, half birds. Harpies are associated in Greek and Roman mythology with disease and famine and dreadful things like that. They're not nice birds, not pretty birds like robins and blue jays. Are blue jays nice? I don't really think blue jays are nice. They're usually considered pretty mean. Like robins and chickadees. These are more like vultures and carrion birds. Anyway, they're associated with disease and famine and want. Anyway, these harpies fly around the woods and help to inflict pain upon the sinners there. Listen to the way Dante starts. Again, his language in this canto is brilliant. Not yet had Nessus finished crossing there when we begin to walk into a grim forest, without a pathway anywhere. Not bright green leaves, but foliage dark and dim. Not sturdy branches, but each a twisted bough. Not fruits, but poison thorns on every limb. Not even the beasts that hate the lands men plow between Corneto and Cesena can roam through such rough, tangled brush as I saw now. Notice how he defines everything by negation. There was no pathway. There was no fruit. There were no sturdy branches. There were no beautiful leaves. Everything is grim and empty and hollow. Virgil points out that they're in the second ring, saying, "Look closely as we go. Here are things that you would call impossible if you had heard me tell you they were so." That's going to be an important idea in just a moment. The idea that there's a difference between hearing about something and actually experiencing it. Dante says, "Hear wailing, deep and pitiful." but there was no one anywhere about, and I grew so perplexed that I stood still. Dante hears the wailing, but he doesn't see where it comes from. I think that he was thinking that I thought that all those voices came from people who, on seeing us approach, had quickly sought to hide themselves. So Dante thinks that Virgil thought that he thought. Notice how very circular and roundabout that expression is. It's the same sort of language he's using when he uses the negation. Everything is told in a circular, superficial kind of way. Again, the idea perhaps that language doesn't express things very clearly, but that experience is a better teacher. Also, it relates to this sort of superficial legalese, courtly kind of talk that they're going to experience even more in just a moment. But Dante mistakenly thinks that maybe the people are hiding around here somewhere and I just can't see them. Virgil clarifies, if you break off a little branch, you will soon see that what you are thinking will be broken too. Again, the repetition, the circularity, if you break a branch, your thinking will be broken. Then I reached out, and from a great thorn tree I tugged a branch until it snapped apart, and the stem cried out, "Why are you tearing me?" Where it was broken, I saw dark blood start. "Why are you mangling me?" it cried again. "Have you no spirit of pity in your heart? Now we are turned to stumps, but we were men when we were on the earth. Truly your hand should show more mercy, even if we had been the souls of serpents." Just as a green brand will burn at one end and the escaping air will hiss as sap drips from the other end, so from the stump words mixed with blood flowed where I had broken it. I dropped it suddenly, and like someone terror-stricken I stood there. So Dante breaks the branch of this tree, and out of the broken branch oozes blood and the voice. These souls have been turned into trees, and they can't talk unless you break them. There's a lot of symbolism here. These are the suicides who have died and become trees. Because they didn't respect their bodies back in life, they don't get bodies in the afterlife. And just as they attempted to express their pain by inflicting pain upon themselves, so in the afterlife, the only way they have of expressing their pain is by being pained. That's what the Harpies are for. They fly around and break the branches and cause the bushes to be able to speak their pain, but also to be more inflicted with pain. Virgil continues and responds to this person, who turns out to be Pierre de la Vigne, and now he's a member of my classroom. Virgil turns to the tree, Pierre, and says, "O wounded soul, if he could have believed what previously he had met only in the pages of my poetry, he would not have raised his hand to you, and yet the thing was so incredible that I came to urge him on, which I myself regret. So that he may make amends, let him know your name, that when, as he will be allowed to do, he returns to earth, he may refresh your fame." So Virgil points out that sometimes experience is the only way to understand something. Dante couldn't have understood this idea unless he had actually experienced it, unless he had gone out into the woods and broken the branch himself. Sure, he's seen the idea in poetry. In fact, the idea shows up in Virgil's poetry, the idea of someone being transformed into a tree, but in reality, no one can really envision that.
We'll see sort of a debate between poetry and experience throughout our text to some extent. How powerful is poetry? How much clout does poetry actually have? And are there points at which we don't actually buy into and believe poetry? It's interesting that it's Virgil who makes this comment, the poet himself, the representation of poetry, who discounts the power of poetry here.
One of my favorite parts of teaching the Inferno is taking my students out in the middle of February into the woods so they can really experience it. So, like Virgil says, because without the experience, you don't actually. We talked about different ideas that drive us and help us to accomplish things. Here's another one. Experience. Pierre goes on to tell his story.
"Allured by such sweet words from you, I cannot stay silent. May it not displease if I am enticed to speak a word or two. I was the man who carried both keys to Frederick's heart. I turned them expertly, locking, unlocking, with such tender ease that scarcely any shared his intimacy."
Pierre was an important counselor of the Emperor Frederick II, but he was accused of being a traitor and condemned, even though he wasn't one. He went on in his despair to commit suicide, which sends him to hell. But at least he's not down with the traitors, right? Think optimistically. Yeah, sorry. But his name is a pun. His name is Pierre de la Vigne, which means Peter of the Vine. Now he's a vine. But his first name, Peter, is also being used as a pun here. Peter was the first pope in Catholic tradition, and he held the keys to the kingdom. Pierre held the keys to Frederick II's kingdom, but then they got taken away. And so as a consolation prize, he says, "Please, take my memory back up to Earth and tell them all I wasn't a traitor." Okay, Pierre, we will. Incidentally, I mentioned that courtly roundabout way of talking, that legalese. That's really what we hear primarily from Pierre. Virgil instructs Dante to continue asking Pierre questions, but Dante doesn't have any more questions. So Virgil asks him, "Hey, would you mind explaining how you turned into a tree?" And Pierre goes on to explain the whole thing about how suicide causes them to lose their bodies since they disrespected them so much. In the final resurrection, when everyone goes up to pick up their bodies, the suicides are going to get to pick up their bodies, but they're not going to get to wear them. They're just going to have them hanging from their trees. But before we leave the woods, we're going to run into one more kind of sinner. It's the kind of sinner who destroyed themselves, not by committing suicide, but by blowing all of their money in gambling. Because they destroyed their property, that still counts. Two men come running up being chased by wild, terrifying dogs. One tries to hide behind a bush, and the dogs tear through the bush and chew him to pieces. Of course, the bush was another suicide, and the poor guy gets broken into tiny pieces and has to call out in his pain. But these are the guys, again, who wasted their money and wasted their property in bad living. But since he's already broken in pieces and then therefore articulate, they talk a little bit to the bush. That brings us to the end of Canto 13. Next time we're going to cross into the third ring of the seventh circle, the Burning Plain. Get excited!
Bum 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 bum. It's Inferno, Inferno. Brrr, bum.